I love that your concern is the danger of it, right? Because otherwise, it's just all comedy. I mean, it's the biggest joke ever. Except, as you said, very very rightly, and this is why I'm furious about it. I don't think it's funny. I mean, I otherwise would think it's just funny because they're so foolish looking. But it's exactly what you said. I mean, it's not just been partisan, stupidity about getting Trump out at all costs. It's about ratcheting up tensions with Russia, and really, from many Democrats and their supporters, really threats of war with Russia. I mean, I that's how I've taken it on MSNBC when they say that Russia has committed acts of war on the United States, which I've heard coming out of MSNBC and Democratic Party people. Gerald Nadler said it was like Pearl Harbor on the Chris A show. Um, that's if I were living in Russia, I would be very concerned about the Democrats taking power. I mean, I'm concerned about the Republicans too, but the Democrats seem bent on escalating tensions with Russia and perhaps even going to war with them. But it's been a consistent belligerent attitude toward Russia, not just Trump, from the Democrats. That's what. That's why I've been so furious about this and following it so closely. If it were just this sort of partisan stuff between Republicans and Democrats for who controls the presidency, I'm way less interested. The Clinton Obama wing of the party, which still holds control of the party, has made it really clear to me since Clinton was in office, since Bill Clinton was in office, that they've wanted to not just extend NATO up to the western borders of Russia, but probably all the way around it in the south. And I think that's probably why they've been in the Middle East so aggressively, because they want, either NATO or some version of NATO encircling Russia entirely. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I mean, the thing is, and that's what they've done. I mean, that's what the coup in Ukraine was about.
Yeah.
And that's what so much of what the Clinton wing of the party has done. Yeah. Listen, I can't argue with that. The problem is I do think it's bipartisan. So, John McCain was in Ukraine cheering on the Maidan protests as well. So I do think it's bipartisan. The one exception really came along in 2015, 2016 with Donald J. Trump.
That's right.
Where he said, we should get along with Russia. And Noam Chomsky has said that what is so tragic and awful about the Democrats and their opposition to Trump is that when he occasionally has a policy position that is not terrible and might even lead to some positive, that's the one that Democrats choose to heavily oppose. So, when he talks about having better relations with Russia, there's nothing wrong with cooperation between the world's top two nuclear powers. And the absence of that cooperation is dangerous for everybody. And also, Trump made some peace overtures towards North Korea and decided that he wasn't going to get in the way of a South Korean-led effort to reconcile. That was a positive thing, I think. But Democrats, because I think they share in this bipartisan hawkish consensus, but also because they don't have much else to oppose Trump on, because they're not, instead of being a progressive party proposing things like health care for everybody and a fair, and economic justice and higher wages for workers. There's a wing of the party that really embraces that, but the mainstream, that's not really their agenda. So they have to find other ways to resist, quote unquote, Trump. And one of the main ways has been to try to be even more hawkish on some issues than Republicans are. And the result is a disaster, because then you have this entrenched bipartisan consensus that is just overwhelmingly for war. And it's very dangerous, not just on the nuclear issue, but also, in Venezuela, Trump is launching a coup. Venezuela is a close ally of Russia. Trump is imposing murderous sanctions to achieve it. But what are Democrats doing? They're cheering it on. And they also, I think, this is not the entire reason, but I think it's also hard for them to bring themselves around to opposing it, and especially for their critics in the media to talk about it, is because even acknowledging it and acknowledging what's actually going on in Venezuela, where you have U.S. even sanctioning Russian firms for dealing there, is to acknowledge that Trump is not Putin's puppet. And because to acknowledge that goes against this comforting narrative you've been presenting for the past 4 years. So, that and many other issues. Trump is also trying to stop the construction of a German-Russia pipeline, a really vital one for both countries, and he's threatened sanctions against it. But who talks about that? Nobody.
Right.
Because I think it goes against the narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I think the opposition, I mean, this all stems from sort of this irrational, hysterical hatred of Trump, you know, part of which I understand and think is somewhat rational, most of which I think is not. But I mean, they obviously just wanted to get him out. I don't think most of them really believe that Russia controlled this country. I mean, that is just too farcical for, you know, even Rachel Maddow and her followers to believe. But I'm, you know, it's why the Democrats have been so hysterical about this one Republican president when they were just fine, basically, with George Bush occupying the office. I mean, they weren't. I mean, they didn't love it, but they weren't up in arms about it, and they weren't doing everything they could to get him out, even though he was about 100 times more destructive than Trump ever could be. Right. Um, I believe it's what he said about foreign policy during the campaign and during and somewhat after, although he, as you said, he immediately kind of reverted to traditional foreign policy almost immediately. He was the first serious presidential candidate ever in American history to actually call into question American imperialism, regime change, NATO itself, you know, the instruments of that, all the bases. I mean, he would go back and forth, but there were moments when he sounded a lot more like Noam Chomsky than he did like the Republican Party or John McCain. And I think that is what is at the real, I think that's what causes the most terror in what's called the deep state, because, you know, the Democratic Party with their Republican allies, it has absolutely been a bipartisan project, but it's been led by the Democratic Party since 1945, essentially building this international order. You know, the Democratic Party built this international order with NATO at the center of it, and Trump comes along and he's sort of like not a part of the party, never got the memo about any of this stuff and how sacred it is, and he starts talking about these hallowed institutions like the UN and NATO and, you know, U.S. hegemony, and saying, well, why the hell do we need this, right? And I believe that's why the deep state, what we call the deep state, that's been opposing him has been made up of the foreign policy establishment, essentially, right? It's been the intelligence agencies and the FBI, which is also part of the foreign policy establishment. Those are the people, I think, who actually faced an existential threat. I think the rest of it, and I think they actually had good reason to hate Trump. The other, you know, the masses of liberals and Democrats who have this irrational hatred of him have this sort of stuff about a daddy figure, I believe, like he's just not the appropriate person to be our father, kind of thing. Like Obama was just right because he dressed right and talked right and acted right. So it's very superficial, like most Americans are with politics. But I do think there's something very deep and very important inside the Trump presidency that scared the living shit out of the foreign policy establishment. I think that's kind of been really pushing kind of the intragovernmental attempts to expel the guy like he's a virus from the body. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I think it's many things. I mean,
Yeah.
when I think for liberal voters, I get the panic because Trump is a pretty vile human being, with a, you know, history of sexual assault, making all kinds of racist and offensive comments. So he's, you know, he's a buffoon, and I think he puts, you know, he's had some terrible policies that, like the, you know, the way he talks about immigrants and his treatment of Muslims. I can go on and on and on. So I understand why voters are particularly scared of him. In the establishment, I agree with a lot of what you said.
Mhm.
It's not because people in the establishment care so much about the rights of immigrants or Muslims or people around the world, but they don't see Trump as a suitable steward of
Right.
the U.S. empire,
Right.
and they want a prettier face like Obama.
Mhm.
And I agree what you said about what Trump as a candidate when he posed as being against intervention. Not because I think he's particularly ideologically committed to opposing U.S. intervention. I think his record has shown that. But I think he had his finger on the pulse in a way that a detached liberal elite like Hillary Clinton didn't.
Mhm.
And Trump saw the damage that wars have done to communities around the country. And he
Mhm.
saw the resentment that people have for spending all this money to occupy and destroy foreign countries instead of building up a crumbled country at home and give people work at a time when a lot of jobs have disappeared. And I think
Mhm.
he was a very good marketer. He tapped into that. And I think that this effort to basically characterize his victory as just the work of Russia is a way to undermine the appeal of his anti-interventionist rhetoric. And I say rhetoric because I don't think he actually meant it. I just think that he's a very good marketer and a very good salesman.
Right.
But when you ascribe all this to Russia's work, that when you oppose intervening in Libya and Syria, that's what Putin wants to do. It's a way to delegitimize the message, and I think elites were afraid to see that Trump's rhetoric on that was appealing. And especially there was even a study that said that in communities with the highest rate of military sacrifice, where communities lost the most people to fighting in foreign wars, there was a huge correlation between military sacrifice and support for Trump.
That's right.
Because people saw Trump as anti-intervention and Hillary Clinton is the embodiment of intervention. So yeah, I do think that a lot of this has to do with that, undermining the appeal of Trump's rhetoric when it comes to not intervening abroad and cooperating with Russia. And it's been successful because no matter what Trump intended, his administration has been very hawkish. I mean, take Ukraine. Obama, it's true that Obama's administration played a big role in the coup there, but Obama himself resisted after that selling weapons to Ukraine because he didn't want to further inflame the proxy war, and he didn't want to arm the neo-Nazis that fight with the Ukrainian forces. And Trump came into office and he was accused of being a traitor and a Putin ally. So it didn't take much for him to sign off on this, to cave. So whatever Trump's intentions were, the reality of his administration has gone in the opposite direction. And, but what's interesting is still for the foreign policy establishment, it's still even not enough to get him to be confrontational. I do think that they are just, they're so uncomfortable with someone so brutish being the face of the U.S. empire.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, I've heard this almost daily for 4 years. He's embarrassing the United States, so we can't do business abroad, which means we can't continue to maintain the empire and expand it, right? And Obama was so great for that.